I'm Raijin Rising, and welcome to my video analysis essay on RWBY's visual evolution. RWBY has evolved a lot over the years, and sure, that's evident in these images here, but the underlying reason, which the recent volumes help us viewers forget, is because Rooster Teeth animation didn't exist in Volume 1. The department began for Volume 3, but Volume 1 was 15 people working impossible hours. But, I mean, who knows what the crew is looking like now that they've grown so much and they're not splitting teams for multiple productions when they're working on Volume 7. This growth means that the show's visual identity is entirely different now from where the show began. Every volume we recognize the visual evolution, yet sometimes it's difficult to put your finger on or difficult to put into words, and as of yet there isn't really an account of what exactly has changed with each volume, at least up through Volume 6, so here it is. RWBY's story is told through two different animation software, Smith Micro's Poser and Autodesk Maya. Poser for the first three, Maya ever since. But no matter what it's being animated in, RWBY makes significant visual changes with every volume. I mean, Volume 3 looks nothing like Volume 1, and, well, Volume 6 is a visual overhaul from really even Volume 5. The show grows from both its production staff and budget getting bigger, but it also grows with each volume's pipeline having across-the-board changes to visual aesthetic. Now that the show has spent 3 volumes in both animation software, it's a good time for this analysis. In this video, I will go through each volume in order and explain the changes, some broader but some rather specific, implemented to character models, environments, lighting, and at the end, effects. I won't be getting too technical, but either way I promise you will learn something here. So let's get into it. RWBY's visual evolution. In Volume 1, in terms of character models, they were literally rough around the edges. There's not really any smooth curves to them. Volume 1's defining trait, though, with character models, however, is what became known as shadow people. The crew realized a little too late into production that they needed background characters, and it was quicker and easier to have solid black models than to design detailed faces and clothing, and then, well, model them. They only made character models for people in this script, like the people who chase Sun, or Weiss's butlers, or the guys Yang was fawning over. There's also someone who was a recolored version of Nora's head put on Glinda's body here at the end of the volume. That was interesting. But if they weren't in the script, they didn't get a model. In terms of environments, the show went for a 2D look in a 3D space. It had bright colors in the background, and the sets overall were vibrant, though rather plain. In terms of lighting, there was not really much to speak of, meaning it often seemed as if there was one setting for night and one for day. And when a lighting effect was there, it was incredibly flat with quite little diffusion to speak of. Volume 1 was rough character models, shadow people, and environments and lighting flat both in shape and in color. In Volume 2, there were no more shadow people. This was the biggest jump in character design. They had the time, and they made the background characters. Models for the returning cast got a little smoother and updated, but they're not completely rounded out yet. Nora lost the bow on her skirt because the rig was problematic, difficult to animate, so it's really only there in Volume 1, and even then it wasn't in the combat scenes. Volume 2 introduced some lighting and effects that made compositing more impressive, for instance the cafeteria and locker room in Volumes 1 and 2. There's big differences here. Lighting in a sense of depth really began in Volume 2. There's no more flat colors used as blanket environmental assets, and the still colorful world of Remnant is darker compared to the first volume. The Beacon Courtyard shows this very well, so I mean, it's no stretch to say that the environmental design evolved immensely in this volume. That could very well amount to more complex textures and shaders, but more than that, in Volume 2 is that Downtown Vale's aesthetic was completely redesigned. It gives the characters more of an ability to stand out from the background as the focus of the scene, while it also gives Vale a different, coherent identity. Volume 2 was rounder character models, actual background characters, better lighting added to better developed sets. Volume 3 was their last volume in Poser, and the jump in production value is rather evident. Rooster Teeth Animation, as a department with a lot of full-time staff, as I said at the beginning of this video, came into being with Volume 3. Volume 2 more or less had the visuals of an updated Volume 1, better lighting, better sets, better models, a beefier compositing process. But Volume 3 had an entirely different visual style. The character models are rounded out, shoulders are curved, clipping happens a lot less, things like that. The character models got sleeker for how they were intended to look, but as an important note, the original proportions didn't really change, and I'll get into that later too. The biggest distinctions for Volume 3 though were its environments and its lighting. The sets are much larger, a lot more detailed. If the crew had to make Amity Coliseum in Volume 1, it simply would not have looked as good as it did. And Volume 3 was really their first foray into a more complex lighting environment. I mean, sure, Volume 2 has the firelight scene, and the composite process is bulkier in Volume 2 than before. The daytime lighting environment was great, but lighting conditions in Volume 3 are a lot more diverse. But as I'll talk about shortly, they did still also have a long way to go from here. I mean, overall, Volume 3 rounded out the character models, fleshed out the sets, and then it lit it all well to boot. And by Volume 3, RWBY looks like a full-fledged production, not a fledgling one. Literally everything changed about RWBY's visual aesthetic when they switched to Autodesk Maya. I cannot overstate this. Volume 4 introduced the Maya engine instead of Poser. The stark difference was a topic of discussion, but the crew made it clear. This is what RWBY would look like from that point on. Relatively speaking, as I'll get into. And given the time skip and change in major narrative arc, it was an opportune time to switch software though. While the first 3 volumes had a 2D look in a 3D environment, which is much more reminiscent of anime, Volume 4 and on abandoned this for a fully 3-dimensional look. With character models, I mean, sure, they have new time skip outfits, but in terms of actual aesthetics, their proportions have been adjusted. Before Volume 4, the female characters only had 4 eye shapes, but more distinct ones came here. Characters' legs aren't rectangles, they have thighs and calves. Shoulders are broader, hands are smaller, more proportionally correct. The proportions aren't realistic, of course, I'm not trying to say that, because this is anime style. Modern anime follows a moe convention, which is incredibly complex of a topic, but aesthetically speaking, all you really need to know is that it means that characters tend to have large heads, big eyes, small noses, and pointed chins. Maya's moe compared to Poser's is more lifelike, less rigid, and admittedly more moe. And the Maya engine is one of the reasons that those time skip outfits even worked. One of Poser's drawbacks was that it was difficult to rig or animate cloth realistically past a certain length. This is why skirts were as short as they were. This is why Nora's bow was removed after Volume 1. Come Volume 4, and Blake and Yang can have long coattails. Weiss can wear a long dress, and then these character models are rigged so their clothes are built to prevent clipping, meaning all this extra cloth does not phase through objects as it so commonly did in Volume 1. A smaller thing to note about character models is that they, as well as weapons and objects, still have outlines like they did in the Poser years, but it's done with a new tool called Pencil. So they're sometimes grayer than they've been before, and they're much thinner, but they're there. But the biggest difference in the aesthetic is active lighting, the ability of shadows to work in real time with how characters and objects move around the set. Shadows didn't move much at all before, and in Volume 1, the only shadows were the people. But now that shadows are proportionate to how light behaves in the real world for the most part. Environmental lighting and effects are a lot more diverse now, even as more than they were in Volume 3. So I mean, here's an environmental effect that took 4 volumes for. Rain. And then that composite set the mood really well for the tavern scene. There are all these various composite and lighting situations in Volume 4 that were almost never present beforehand, and the audience owes that to Maya. Practically every set they used in Volume 4 was new and was made in the off-season. The story leaves Beacon Academy behind, and any time Beacon is shown, they either use a shot directly from Volume 3, or they whip it up in Poser again. To recap Volume 4's advancements, the crew adjusted character model proportions, introduced active lighting, and then diversified the types of lighting and effects. Volume 5 showed changes to the Maya look that are rather subtle, but they really define that volume's visual aesthetic. This mostly has to do with the lighting of environments rather than their scale. Volume 5's environments are lit more darkly compared to Volume 4. It's sorta in the same vein with how Volume 2 followed the first. So here's a lighting change that you might not have noticed. The crew added a third layer for lighting on characters. In Volume 4, if a character is shaded, there's only one part in light and one part in shadow, but in Volume 5, there is a third light layer to act for harsh light when necessary. And lastly, the bloom effect, which is when light emanates off characters and objects, continues to come through strongly in this volume. This was present in Volume 4, but I'd say Volume 5 turns it up. Volume 5 made a lot of slight changes to the Maya look of this show. The additional lighting layer on characters to show harsh light contrast, scenes lit relatively darkly, and the bloom effect define most of the aesthetic evolution. Volume 5 looks different from Volume 4, but it's not too different. This all changes with Volume 6. Just like the third volume of RWBY shows the most drastic changes the crew made in Poser, the sixth shows the most drastic ones that crew made in Maya. After Volume 5, they started working on Genlock. So many of the visual changes made to RWBY for Volume 6 came as a result of the techniques they also decided to define Genlock with. The most noticeable of these is that depth of field became standard, necessary almost, in nearly if not every shot. Sure, they did play with focal depth in previous volumes, but in this one, it's kind of the norm. Something else the crew added to environments was the use of matte paintings as backgrounds. All of these images are, well, flat, but they're layered to allow for 3D assets to appear to interact with them to make it look 3D if the scene necessitates it. For the most part, the compositing process in Volume 6 does not use a third lighting layer. It's there, but sparingly, so it's in this scene in Salem's Keep, and then again in the shots at the front of the airship, and then of Cinder and Neo in the finale. So all in all, Volume 6 gets rid of the bloom effect, and instead uses depth of field to show characters' immersion with the environment. It uses matte paintings, and it still uses a third lighting layer, but only sparingly, and for cases where it's very harsh or to add a certain tone. As I go forward, now that I've looked at character models, environments, and lighting, I'm going to show how various overall comparisons for effects changed through volumes 1 through 6, because they didn't really have a place elsewhere in this video, so keep watching to see how aura, some environments, and then semblance effects, and other things have changed with every volume. All of this talk of look and aesthetics and visual identity matters because RWBY does not have any one distinct one. Volumes 1 to 3 sorta share one, yeah, broadly, as do volumes 4 through 6 and likely onward. But with a different pipeline for aesthetics and look every volume, amidst all these changes, RWBY hasn't found any one place to settle and just be. You know, they're using every volume's pipeline to test different effects like bloom and depth of field. But I do want to see it find its place. I want to see the crew stick with one visual identity for the show. I mean, we can't ignore that RWBY's identity has changed as RT Animations has. Again, this was the Volume 1 crew, and then the department got so big it had to leave the main Rooster Teeth facility to fit into its own space a couple years ago at this point, and it's gotten a lot bigger since then when they hired a lot more talent for Genlock. Each volume reflects what RT Animation was at that time. But now that the department is settling, not growing too much at the moment, I believe RWBY should be doing the same for Volume 7. But then again, on the other hand, with the entire department working on this, they may be able to take leaps that they didn't have the time to before, so we'll have to wait and see. Volume 6 is wildly different from Volume 1. And yes, a huge part of that is because of animation and fight choreography, but they're also not the topic of this video. In visuals alone, Remnant looks like an entirely different world now. In 2012, Rooster Teeth trusted Matsu to make this weird anime-looking show where sniper scythes exist. And every year since, its look evolves. Let me know what you think. I do plan on uploading semi-regularly, so if you want to see more like this or hear more of my take on the show, please do like and subscribe and comment to let me know. I know, sure, YouTubers say that a lot, but when I do, it actually makes a difference, as I'm just now starting out on YouTube and I know you're not subscribed to me. I'm Rising, and this is some pretty cool stuff.